Welcome to Running in the 70s, where we interview, meet, and get to know athletes of all kind who were running in the 70s. I'm your host, Matthew Kleinowski.
Today on the podcast, we're with Bernie Greene, a hillbilly by birth, a statistician by trade, a creative writer by faith, and a competitive athlete, and an animal lover by nature. I'm not going to say any more. Welcome on the podcast, Bernie Greene. Hi, Bernie.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
Bernie, let's tell everybody your origin story as a competitive athlete and a runner. Where'd you grow up and how did you get started?
I grew up in a little town in north central Pennsylvania. The name of the town is Renovo, Renovo. It's a sprawling metropolis of 1,000 people. My graduating class had 66 kids in it. It was a wonderful time growing up. I was born in 1944, grew up there in the 50s, and left town for good when I went away to college in 1962.
And how did you start getting involved in competitive sports growing up?
I had a baseball bat, a tennis racket, and a basketball in my hands from the age of 2. I played all those sports competitively through high school and again in college for 4 years in college. I did not play college tennis because it overlapped with the baseball season.
And how important was competition to you as a person? How much of that was your psyche or identity?
Other than academics, that was the whole ball of wax. I wanted to be a good student. I wanted to be a good athlete. Back in those days, I had a crew cut, if you can believe it. The athletic look in those days would have a flat top or a crew cut. And even those of us with real fine hair who had to use a butch wax on the hair to get it to stand up, that's what we did. And that was part of my identity for sure.
Who were your early sports heroes and idols then from that time frame that you remember?
Boy, that's easy. They were the biggies, Mickey Mantle in New York City. I listened to 150 out of the 152 games that he and Maris were chasing Ruth in 61. It was Mantle. I loved the Boston Celtics. Maybe I was always doing with winners. In football, of course, I loved Jimmy Brown, Otto Graham, guys like that. Those were my heroes. But Bill Russell was a hero.
Where'd you go to university?
I went to a small Division III school in Chicago, Illinois, North Park University. I was recruited to play basketball and baseball. My uncle was the former head basketball and baseball coach at Cornell University. So he had an in on the recruiting. He shifted to a smaller Division III school before I graduated from high school. So that's where I attended.
What year did you graduate from university?
1966.
How did you get into running? When did your running streak start?
I started in 1970, January 1. In 1970, I was about 20 years old. It got to be very tedious to stay fit. Try to look around for 5 guys in the gym and the basketball or a tennis partner who was of like mind and like ability to stay fit. I read Cooper's book on aerobics. He later founded the Cooper Institute in Dallas, of course, Fitness Institute. It was based on the Air Force points. You got a maximum number of points for running this far for so many minutes and so on. I figured, what the heck, I'll do that. So I put on my cotton shorts and my wigwam wool socks, and out the door I went. In those days, if you saw another runner, it was like you immediately thought of this person as a kindred spirit. Hey, I'm not the only one who's nuts. I was doing this. I read everything I could get my hands on, of course, and I was soon setting so many aerobics points every day. I just started logging them out.
One way to be running in those days, see somebody and just wave, say hey, tip your hat. Yeah. What kind of shoes were you wearing? You were an athlete. You had all kind of different sports shoes. What did you run in?
I had Adidas shoes that were absolutely flat on the bottom, and they were made out of the same material that you might make a pennant out of, like velvet or something. And I remember wearing them in a race once when it was raining and my feet got purple. I'll die in the shoe. And I ran in Puma. My first big time shoe was when Bill Bowerman and Nike came out with the Nike Elite. That was a cross between a racing shoe and a training shoe. And that was like, whoa, that was like miracle.
We'll talk about those early years in the 70s, what was going on. But was there a point when you said, I'm a runner?
Oh boy, that was so early. Within a few months of running, I realized that what gave me the biggest thrill was being in the middle of the basketball game, totally exhausted, staying inside this guy's shirt on the defense, not giving him a moment to breathe. It was those intense kind of moments of total commitment to a rope and just totally disregarding whether you wanted to quit, you were tired, whatever. Those are the things that thrilled me the most. What I liked the most about baseball is when Dad would hit me fungo flies and I would just chase them down by the hour. So I realized what it is that I'd been getting off on all this time, and it turned out to be running.
When did you enter your first race?
Strangely enough, my very first race was the 1973 Harrisburg Marathon, the very first one ever. If you know anything about it, and I've written about it in my writing later on, it was it was a heat wave on the East Coast. It was Labor Day, and the Harrisburg organizers thought it was cool to start at high noon. They started the race at high noon like the Boston Marathon did, and we were in the middle of a heat wave. It was about 90, 95 degrees, and the temperature and humidity were up there. I changed twice out of my cotton clothes during the race and pinned the number on. I ducked into garages, and they stood still. So my nickname thereafter became Flash Green. I don't think it was because of the speed I showed that day. I was in the nude in an open garage as the runners were going by. There was a 12-year-old that finished the race that day, Gary Steiner, Pennsylvania runner. I went down there with them, and I ran that race with an Air Force buddy from my hometown that I got together with, who turns out he was a marathoner too, named Jim Botsford. He was home from Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, in the Midwest there. So that really was not so much a race as it was a scavenger hunt for water.
I lived in Harrisburg. Where did the race start?
The race started downtown on Market Street. I think it was right in front of the bank. And I remember what the temperature says right outside the bank. It was 95. It's like everybody just looked at one another. And of course, the instructions before the race were just be very careful and that sort of thing. Everybody just ran anywhere. It was just like everybody felt a little bit like they were lining up at the start of Pickett's charge. On the southern side, the race wended its way through the Harrisburg area for a while. Then it went north along the Susquehanna and finished at Penn National Raceway on the race course. They sent us around the last lap of the race course. I thought I was going to break an ankle because it had rained a few days before and the horses had run there and the track hadn't been regroomed after that. You had all these ruts and bumps and everything. Basically, you were picking your way along on the 26th mile of the race, trying not to break an ankle.
That's great. Let's talk about all the things that probably weren't there. Entry fee, awards, water stations, signposts, timing marks.
Almost non-existent. My dad was following us in the car. I say mostly me, and he would tell me how many miles he'd driven, that kind of stuff. But they did it. I'm sure they had course marshals at just the right places to turn. When we went to the east off whatever route it was going north, and then to curve into going east to Penn National Raceway. And I don't remember any awards or anything. We got a time and our results published somewhere. A hard copy to be sure. There was no internet in those days. And so, of course, it made the hometown newsletter because my dad was a writer for the newspaper there and he wrote it up.
Wow. Your very first race was a marathon.
Right.
Not a lot of people start with a marathon. How much mileage were you doing in your running?
By then, I was not up over 100 miles, but I was doing at least 60 or 70 miles a week. That was the thing then. Joe Henderson was talking about long, slow running, this, that, and the other thing. I had a motto from Shorter on my wall, even though I was an adult and he was younger than I. It said, somewhere in the world, someone is training when you're not. When you race him, he'll win. Nobody was going to out-train me.
You were a classic, passionate fan for professional athletes. When did running then get on your radar and become part of your life as a fan?
Oh, as a fan. As soon as I became a runner, right, then I started following the guys that were really good at it. The Frank Shorters, John Anderson, I remember, early winner of the Boston Marathon. Of course, they wore the flimsy racing shoes that had absolutely no heel counter in, and we all wanted to wear those. So one of the early shoes I got before the Nike Elites was a Tiger Jayhawk. Absolutely flat, gummy sole. You could probably wear it for 3 races and you had to get a new pair.
Right. Well, who were you training with? Anybody?
No, not in the early days. I didn't mention that in the early days from 70 to 73, I was actually in the Chicago area and I would train on an 11 laps to the mile track.
Outdoors.
Yeah. At first, I started running in Converse All-Stars. Then I gravitated to the outside, and I had a running daddy, I call him, a guy who was a professional bowler who ran to stay in shape for bowling, which I could never figure out.
Wow.
But he had a string of 3 or 4 years going of running without missing a day, and I wanted to be like him. So I came back east and went to the State College in Penn State. In 1973, I joined the Nittany Valley Track Club, and that's where I ran from 1973 to 1980.
The Nittany Valley Track Club, who organized that? Who was in it? And what kind of racing and training did you do with them?
One of the honchos was Harry Groves, the Penn State track and cross country coach. He was a training partner of mine. Dave Colton, an excellent miler, runner. He didn't run distance too much, but there were various presidents of the Nittany Valley Track Club, and I don't remember them now. I know some of the people that I knew there are still running, and the guy George Etzweiler's close to 100 or over 100 now. He's still running.
Wow. Wow. Did you do the estimate your time runs?
No. We never did that. We did 24-hour relays on the Parkway track and stuff like that. The second marathon I ever ran there, I also wrote about because that was the first annual Nittany Valley Track Club Marathon, and that was in sub-zero wind chill. So the article that came to mind out of that when I later became a runner, first 2 races were a race in 100-degree, felt a heat index of 100 heat, and then sub-zero wind chill is out of the frying pan into the freezer. And that was the name of the article.
That's great. What do you wear for that race? Do you remember?
I wore 2 layers of cotton sweats, and I wore a wool dickie underneath, 2 caps, socks on my hands, 2 pairs of socks on my hands because I just didn't have the right equipment at all. Then, of course, you got sweaty, and when you turned into the wind, whoa, you were freezing. So it was brutal. It was brutal, but we finished.
Let's talk about your running streak. You're logging your miles. You ended up with more than 2 decades of running without missing.
That's correct. First 24 years, I didn't miss a day. 1994, I ran downhill and down here in the Washington, D.C. area, running with really one of the best running clubs in the country, the Montgomery County Road Runners Club. There was a downhill race, and I wore racing flats like an idiot. In 94, I was 50. I tore two cartilages in my left knee, and it took me 4 months to get to the operating room because I had a doctor that didn't clear me to see an orthopedic guy. And when I was in that health maintenance organization at the time, I had to take 4 months off, and that's when I became a creative writer. And that's where the creative writer by fate comes in.
What do you remember about not being able to run and the end of your streak?
My first article was titled, Actually, I'm Not Running. And it was based on the premise that just like the dieter, who, regardless of what you happen to be doing at the moment, will tell you that what they're actually doing is not eating, right? Whatever I was doing at the moment, be it biking or walking or playing with my cat or whatever, what I was actually doing was not running.
Wow. Yeah.
Was pure hell for 4 months. And it gave me my first article. Actually, I'm not running. And I can remember a shower, things that I used to do after a run that were a celebration of life. Every day it was a run. It was a joy to be out there. I was never under the illusion that I might be able to do it forever, but I would come in from runs some days and I would say, Lord, kill me now. It doesn't get any better than this. And then I would go take a shower and I would stand up and it'd be a celebration and so on. And I'd go eat breakfast. It would be a savory celebration for everything that preceded it. And after that, I would stand under the shower and it just felt strangely like falling water and nothing else. And same with breakfast. It tasted like cardboard.
So
I was in a bad.
You're a scientist, a statistician. Had you been doing writing much in your academic life? What was the transition to creative writing, and how did you find an outlet where to publish?
Until I became a creative writer and first started writing about running, as it turned out, the only things I'd ever written in my life were book reports as a kid, term papers in college, a master's thesis, and a doctoral dissertation. Different kind of writing entirely. I became a writer just because I wanted to work out my pain on the printed page. I published my first few articles in the Montgomery County Roadrunners Club newsletter. It was called The Rundown. I got a lot of positive feedback for it, so I was hooked on that. I could live for 2 months on a good compliment, as the saying goes. And then I saw it in 1976, a publication come out in central Pennsylvania called the Runner's Gazette, America's first running newspaper, still going strong. Another editor and publisher had it then, and Freddie and her husband at the time, around 1980 or so, purchased it, and Freddie still has it today. At any rate, so I noticed that, and I sent her some of my writing, and so I became a regular columnist there. I would have 5, 6, 10 things sometime every issue. I wrote poetry too. They have a poet's corner in there. George Hancock, he writes poetry for there. And so we were dueling poets, don't you know, and challenging metaphors and all that sort of thing. So I got a lot of positive feedback for that too. I enjoyed writing for Freddie. At one time, I didn't do it regularly, but I had publications in 13 other publications around the country. I've wrote for Running Times, Marathon and Beyond, the Oregon Distance Runner, the Annapolis Streak, the Big Kick out of Miami. I'm trying to think now. A Washington Running Report. I met all these people, of course, when I would attend the RRCA conventions. I met Galloway and Henderson and Cardong and got their picture, got to talk to them. And And they knew all about the Runner's Gazette because there weren't too many publications like that in the country.
Let me ask you about your writing journey there. George Hancock took the approach a lot of times of just writing about what he would see on his runs. You've written like that. You have a story with a little girl, how your outlook on life and everything changed when a little girl spilled some groceries. You've written very thoughtful, metaphorical allegories with comparing your life to the Battle of Gettysburg. I'm a mathematician. Getting away from the science part of your life, where do the ideas generally come from, and what was your routine for creative writing in the day?
I got a lot of my ideas on a run. I just paid attention to my thoughts. I think creative writers need to pay attention to their out of the blue thoughts, especially where in the left side of their brain when they're running. And as Jerry Seinfeld said, you show me a person who has no garbage, and I'll show you a person who's not eating. I feel the same way. You show me a writer who's out of ideas, and I'll show you a person who's not paying attention to what they're thinking about. It doesn't matter how bizarre the connection. It's my philosophy that there's nothing new under the sun, but there is a different take on things. I realized that growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania without television for the first 13 years of my life, what we did then was we sat around on people's porches at night telling stories. And we knew how to tell a story and how to listen to a story. I just tapped into the creative juices that had been building even as a kid, and I didn't realize it because a lot of the stories were humorous. I eventually wrote a column for Freddie Carlin called Dr. Greene, and I wrote Q&As. There'd be Q&As, and it would be a humorous column. I would make up the Q, and then I would make up the A, but I knew what the A was going to be before I made up the Q. But to tell you what the journey was, is I've never written about how to run a faster 5K. That makes me hurl. I know. That's for Runner's Gazette, Runner's World, and whatever. How to run a faster 5K, how to survive your first marathon, blah, blah, blah. I only used running as a vehicle initially to get into an article that I wanted to write about something else. Satchmo said, when asked about his music, he said, what we play is life, not music. We play life. I wanted to write about life. I used running to get me into those articles. I saw my task as a writer as just like writers that write novels, their task is to make an emotional connection with the reader, with the first sentence or two, the hook. I tried to use whatever I could as the hook to get me into writing about life.
It's interesting. People can still read what you're writing. Your articles are not just for runners. As you say, they're articles about life. You've got one article about how to call in sick. It's just a complete humorous essay of, as a runner and as any person, how to fake it. So if you need a day off and you need to go running, what do you do before, during, and after your day off so you can get away with it? Yeah, there's all kind of fun stuff like that. I'm really going to encourage people. We'll put some links on the podcast website to several of your articles, and people can find Runner's Gazette. Let's talk about some of the people you met before you had to stop running with your injury in the Nittany Valley Track Club. There were some spectacular runners, of course, at Penn State in the 70s. You mentioned training with Harry Grove. Who are some of the other figures there? And did you end up writing from stories of that period?
Absolutely. I remember Paul Stemmer, Greg Fredericks, and McGuire. Fredericks for a while held the American record at 10 miles. Of course, Harry Groves was there. Dave Felice was, he was a young kid in high school then, or a little younger than that. I knew he was coming on. George Etzweiler is the guy that's over 100 now, and so on. But I was concerned more with beating the guys in the submasters and masters group at that point in time.
Harry Groves has gone on now. What do you remember about Harry?
He was great. He was a character. He was very irreverent, but as a training partner, he was marvelous. I always looked up to him. We were running a lot of races. We ran about the same pace when Harry was training, and he was good. He was a bit older than me. Indeed, a guy named Glenn Stevens. Glenn Stevens and Harry Groves and I came up Benner Pike, College Avenue, on the 1977 Arts Festival 10-miler in July. I was 10 yards ahead of Harry at the 9-mile mark, and Glenn was 10 yards ahead of me. So here you had Harry, me, and Glenn separated by 10 yards each. And that's the way it was at the 9-mile mark. And we surged our guts out coming uphill on the Benner Pike into town, surged. And every time I looked at the back of Glenn Stevens' jersey, he was getting no closer, and I could hear Harry behind me, and he was getting no closer. And that's the way we finished. It was the most exciting race I've ever been a part of. I felt like Salazar and Beardsley in the duel in the sun. I was ready to collapse, and so was everybody else. But it was just marvelous fun. I just appreciated Harry telling stories and telling it like it was on the run when we were in training and so on. I got a big kick out of him.
I love it that you mentioned early on storytelling and the value of the habit of listening, which aligns with your habit of paying attention to what's going on in your head and going on around you. It's fascinating. Some of your writing where you'll go into historical details of language and cities and battles. Was that things that you had to research, or were those things that you had through your life already read about and were just pulling?
I researched a little on the Battle of Gettysburg, but I'm lucky at this age that my memory is still intact. I'm writing a book on my hometown on Renovo right now. It's called Appalachian Adolescence, about growing up there in the 50s. One of the chapters is titled, What's in a Name? Everybody in my hometown, and I do mean everyone, had a nickname. There are grown people, even now, that I don't know what their proper name is, and you won't know it until they die or get married and you see it on a program somewhere, what they actually were called. And so that article had over 800, 1,000 nicknames in it, and I did it from memory.
Oh,
But people say you did it from memory, but I use mnemonic devices to remember these things. What I did, I took a walk, a mental walk all over town, and I asked myself, who lived there? Who lived there? Who lived there? Then I depended on my memory to remember what their nicknames was.
yeah.
But I made
for movie fans, that's a Hannibal Lecter technique, and of course, it's an old ancient Greek technique. Yeah, that's fantastic. The memory palace technique used for remember Renovo nicknames. It's fantastic, Bernie.
That's the way I would remember things if I got ideas out on the run. I would use a mnemonic to myself. 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door, 5 is a hive, and whatnot. 1 is a bun. Whatever I saw that I wanted to write about, I would picture it lying in a hot dog bun. People who use memory devices know that the more bizarre the association, the better, because then it's not conflicting with any other information you have stored. If you meet somebody who's named Betsy and you remember her name and she's wearing glasses, and see that her glasses are turned on the side B for Betsy or something like that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic thing. I'm a big fan of it too. I remember the day in my 10th grade biology class where the professor said, give me 20 items in any order and I'll rename them. And then he taught us all the presidents of the United States in order. Probably could do 1 through 15 today from 10th grade. Yeah, this is just great stuff. Let's go with what became your significant career as a creative writer that started by accident. The hundreds and hundreds of articles that you've written led to, of course, your Writer of the Year award. How did that come and how did that feel when that happened?
That's a contest. You submit articles to the RRCA panel. It was 1996 when one of my submissions won. I flew to Colorado Springs and made the acceptance speech there. And that was a lot of fun. I honored my father because basically my dad wrote for the town newspaper, but he was just a worker on the Pennsylvania Railroad, but he always wanted to be a writer. So he wrote for the town newspaper, a few columns and so on. And every time I sat down to write, I would think about Dad and I would drink a little coffee and I would go for it. He was big in my life.
That's wonderful, Bernie. What was the article that you submitted that led to you winning the award?
It was A Stardust Memory.
That's the one with the little girl.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And
Right.
that's a true story. True story.
What, could you tell that story?
Basically, I had been fretting about something for several days. It disturbed my sleep and so on. Usually things you're fretting about have to do with self-centeredness kind of concerns. I don't even remember what it was. So I went for a run that morning, but I was a little bit late. So I ran around my neighborhood. And so I really was pushing the pace on a local, just a 5K around the neighborhood or something like that. And I turned down a certain street called Tabor Street, which is about 4 miles from where I live right now. And a young girl was taking out her family's garbage. And in those days, they didn't have the plastic bags. You just had a paper bag you set by the curb, and the bag was wet on the bottom, and it broke. And as I passed her, I was in a bad mood, and I just said, "Too bad, not my problem," to myself. But then something just pulled me up short. Like, what kind of person have you become here, Bernard? I went back and helped her pick up the garbage, and I said, "Go get another bag from your mom." And it's a tremendous memory for me. When she looked at me, she looked like every person in pain. And as I ran on, I realized that I wasn't really worried about myself anymore. And I asked myself what had happened. And I just realized that I had a visit from the transcendent. The transcendent broke into my life and called me out of myself to reveal the kinship of everyone. That was that, but we are, after all, bits of ancient stardust. And so for me, it was a stardust memory, the stardust moment.
It's great that was recognized and can get some attention. We'll put it on the website so everybody can enjoy reading it.
That's a perfect example of the kinds of things that I wanted to write, other than humorous stuff, write about that, because running adds meaning to people's life. People do what is meaningful, what has meaning for them. It's why the poets write poetry and the mountain climbers climb mountains. I found meaning in running, and it made my life different too when I ran.
I want to ask you about your acceptance speech. You have a good sense of humor, creative, scientific. How was your preparation for the acceptance speech of that award? And were you nervous at all going in?
Yes and no. I had rehearsed. Freddie Carlick was the Eastern Region director then. She was there. And we went into the auditorium in the afternoon. And I rehearsed the speech. And when I wrote the speech, I wrote it out in prose, of course, but then I added what Winston Churchill said were the dots. Winston Churchill once asked a woman who typed his speeches up, "Where did you put the dots?" And she said, "I didn't put any." And by the dots, he means the necessary pauses for effect. You spoke slowly, and you paused after certain parts of a sentence for emphasis. So I learned on the fly about how to do the Winston Churchill kind of thing. The title of it is Fight One More Round. Here it is. Thank you for honoring me with the 1996 Writer of the Year Award. Since I am relatively new to writing, having begun just 2 years ago when a torn knee cartilage curtailed my running, I'd like to take a moment to share with you a few things about my background. I'm a hillbilly by birth, a statistician by trade, a competitive athlete by nature, and as you now know, a writer by fate. I often ask myself why the transition from runner to writer at the age of 51 went fairly smoothly for me. The answer is always the same. My father, a walking paradox, if ever there was one. He was a rough and tumble boxer with the soul of a poet, a railroad worker eking out a living in Appalachia while dreaming of becoming a professional journalist. My fascination with words began as a toddler in Dad's lap as he read the daily newspaper to me. First the sports section, then the front page, and finally the comic strips. Years later, during my adolescence, Dad's huge collection of inspirational literature became my preferred reading material. While many folks would consider much of his collection hokey, these articles, books, and poems formed the basis for my athletic aspiration and played a pivotal role in the soul of our relationship. Before each baseball game, basketball game, or tennis match, Dad would read his motivating selection du jour to me as we cruised around town in the car. His favorite was, as you might expect, chock-a-block with allusions to boxing, but is in reality a metaphor for perseverance, which, by the way, came in handy during my marathoning days. It's titled Fight One More Round, and it goes in part like this. It was former heavyweight champion of the world, James J. Corbett, an athlete with limited physical ability, but with great competitive spirit, who said, fight one more round. When your feet are so tired, you have to shuffle back to the center of the ring. Fight one more round. When your arms are so tired you can hardly lift them to come on guard, fight one more round. When your nose is bleeding and your eyes are black and you wish your opponent would crack you one on the jaw and put you to sleep, don't quit. Fight one more round. Naturally, after a pep talk like that, I was primed to throw myself into the fray with abandon and never to yield. Even now, when I write, I feel Dad's presence at the keyboard. And although I'm still a little terrified, every time I sit down to write in front of a blank screen and wonder if I have anything of value to say, I think of his unfulfilled desire to be a professional writer, and then I drink a little coffee and I go for it. Thanks again for this award. To borrow a line from a golden oldie, when the angels ask me to recall the thrill of them all, I will tell them I remember. That's it.
Oh, that's great, Bernie. Yeah, poetry in prose. Yeah, fantastic.
So it was important to me that I read the last line. If the angels ask me to recall the thrill of them all, I will tell them, pause, I remember, pause, this.
Yeah.
I owe that to Winston Churchill.
Nice. Well, who was there that day?
Cardong was there. Henderson was there. Shorter was not there. Henderson, Cardong, and Galloway were all there. They had nice words to say about it afterwards. and there were some great runners there, some 10K champions at the time. The British woman's 10K, who just son, I forgot what her name was, but at any rate, so there were some champion runners in the audience too, and won Runner of the Year awards and so on.
Nice. So with this conversion to writing and pretty good success and recognition early on, was this something that you knew would continue for the next several decades? When did you get back into the things you're doing now, like teaching aerobics, physical, significant effort?
My writing career is not over, of course, but I wrote all the articles I wrote between 1994 and 2005. January 27th, 2005 was my last run ever. I was 61 and I was running on knees that needed scoped yet again that morning. And so I did my last run just hobbling along, and running by that time had become negatively reinforcing in the sense I couldn't run fast enough or hard enough to get the beta endorphins going to shut off the pain anymore. After surgery, my surgeon came in and said, I remember his words exactly, "You can keep on running, but I need to give you a couple of knee replacements within a year or two." And I went cold turkey. And I went to my local fitness center and I was just messing around post-surgery, and somebody said, "How would you like to come on in and take this spinning class?" Which is a misnomer. It's really studio cycling, but spinning is a European term that means efficient cycling. He was really spinning out there in the Tour de France today. And it was discovered by Jonathan Goldberg, 1989 in Santa Monica, California. In the early 2000s, it became a thing in fitness centers. So I became an instructor. I started doing it and I got hooked immediately because it gave me a little yaha. I became an instructor a few months later. I've been doing that, and I've thrown most of my creative energies into the playlists and music. So I researched that up the wazoo, just like I did running and writing. But I still write for a local writers group here now for a book they're coming out with. My chapter is going to be called Parody He Wrote. So I write parodies like Bill Yankovic or whatever his name was, and
Weird Al, yeah.
still write poetry, but it's about different topics. I still keep in touch with Freddie and so on, my former editor and publisher.
Let's just talk then about the sport of running from the 60s, from starting running in the 70s. Of course, running has changed dramatically. All the sports have changed dramatically. Money, career length, drugs, testing, media, then social media. Just what are your reflections on the last 5-6 decades of sports and the changes?
Wow. I think today's athletes are bigger and stronger and faster, of course. To pick my all-time NBA team, I'm still starting with Bill Russell in center. Maybe I'd have Larry Bird and Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson too. So there are some athletes that transcend generations, I think. But in writing, of course, my heroes were Shorter, Rogers, and Salazar. And I lost touch with running a little bit thereafter, but I know what it's like nowadays. I did quibble with the fact when Jeff Galloway wrote his book on how to extend your endurance by walking 1 minute out of every 8 or something like that. I understood that, but I thought if people wanted to really know the mystique of the marathon and what runners face when they run it, that they had to run the whole way.
Interesting.
Henderson once said, running 26 miles as fast as you could. The only good reason to do it is because you want to. I wrote an article once called The Pain of the Marathon, or when marathon is a metaphor. One of the quotes in there was Don Cardong or somebody turned to another person and said, at the 20-mile mark, why couldn't have Pheidippides died here? But there's a general acknowledgement that when you're at the 20-mile mark, you're halfway. You are halfway in terms of the mental effort and even just the way your body's going to feel. And if people want to understand the mystique of the marathon, why do people talk about it? Why is it glorious and so on? It's because each person who finishes has faced down that pain of being out of fuel, because it's really difficult. At least in the early days, we didn't know how to load enough to get us much past 20. I really pulled it off and still run as well as I could. I remember in the early days, if Frank Shorter was drinking it, we drank it. So out on the course, I had Fizz Cola.
All right.
And then Gatorade came out. And we thought, whoa, this is great stuff. Until we found out it wasn't isotonic and it was too syrupy, and it just sat in your stomach and yanked water out of the tissues. It's like you had to cut it half and half with water. And these little gels don't work right if you don't drink enough water.
Yeah, another thing I think Frank said is, if somebody discovered horseman or made you run 3 minutes faster than the marathon, everybody'd be lining up behind the cow to eat. Yeah.
In one of the articles, somebody alluded to some endurance test that they gave mice once. They threw them in a bucket of water and see how long they could swim. And one mouse, they gave him just regular mouse food. The other one, they gave him all the B vitamins, liver. And the last one they gave desiccated liver too. And that's the one that was still swimming at the end of the experiment. So I took desiccated liver for a while before marathons.
Yeah, there's some science, and then there's, of course, lucky hats and lucky jerseys and lucky socks and everything else. So, yeah, it's a wonderful thing.
There's one other thing that I'd like to touch on was just our running attire, what it was like for us when we first started off. I was in wool wigwam socks, cotton shirts and cotton shorts, got wet, chafing and whatnot. And then we had certain tricks, even in those days. I would wear my socks inside out so the seam wouldn't be rubbing on my toes, or I would tape my feet. I saw some runners doing that. We would tape our nipples with Band-Aids over them. What else did we do? Well, we had
the thigh chafing.
Yeah, we had skin lube. I used to write skin lube between my thighs, under our armpits, all those kind of things. And when Dolphin first came out with their first running short, it was like, whoa, it's just great stuff. So I was part of all these miracles that were happening. There's like all these, quote, scientific advances. So there was no wicking shirts in those days, but then eventually there was. So a lot of times we ran shirtless and just hooked our number under our shorts.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Let me ask you then, just again, if you have thoughts on the idea of super shoes, doping, technology. They lengthened the baseball season. Of course, it took a while. Maris's home run was on 162 instead of 154 game. Sports changes, life changes over the years.
It's been amazing. It was tougher for us, but yeah, the doping scandal in baseball, that was bad news. I'm happy to say I still root for the Yankees. Aaron Judge is clean. He's a monster. I love him to death. As we used to say, because I played a lot of baseball, you can see here, I have 2 arthritic fingers here. I have arthritic to show that I was a pitcher. Aaron Judge can hit the ball out of any park in the country, including Yellowstone. Always the legends. We always joke a lot. I say I could throw a ball pretty fast. I didn't have a major league curve. I said I struck out a guy looking on strikes once. It was struck out looking by the umpire, and he turned to look at the ump, and the ump goes, "Where do you think it was?" He says, "It sounded low."
Wow, that's great. When do you expect to have your book finished and published?
I had hoped to have it done this fall. I'm not sure if I'm going to make it. I have a few more chapters to go. My town's homecoming, they have the flaming Foliage Festival in Renovo. It's a town homecoming. It's the second full weekend of October every year. The population of the town swells to between 5 and 10,000 people. It's gridlocked there. They have a parade around town where the high school girls are vying to be queen of the pageant and so on. It's a big deal. I'd like to have it done by then. We'll see.
That sounds like a little bit of a time machine trip to visit Renovo for that pageant.
It's the most remote town east of the Mississippi. The largest place close to it is really Williamsport, 55 miles away. When my dad had his leg cut off in a railroad accident, the bottom half of his leg, they had to take him 55 miles in an ambulance to Williamsport to a competent hospital. It has been written in the New York Times. This is the most rural town east of the Mississippi. In other words, it's right up in the middle of deer and bear country, Potter County, Clinton County, like Cumming Center. There's nothing big around it.
That's great. It's interesting how formative those things are, where we're born, when we're born, the people that we had the fortune to be with in our early lives, and how father touched you and still makes for you vivid memory and vivid emotion is very nice to see.
It's also Renovo is also the town with the highest level of poverty in Pennsylvania now. It has to do with the amount of retirees there, plus the fact that the Pennsylvania Railroad is gone. And so the people that work there either work for the school or the hospital or one of the businesses in town, of which there are a few, or they work out of town and drive their commute there, or they go away for the whole week and come back on the weekend. Lock Haven's a nearby place. That's more like 5 or 10,000 people, but it's pretty small too. We used to say that Lock Haven was the rear end of Pennsylvania and that Renovo was 26 miles up it.
Yeah, I grew up in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and it's another sort of tragedy story that way, in which the steel mills all closed by the early 1980s. Then lifestyle there and safety and everything. It's no longer a place where people don't lock their doors and kids go to the playground and run in the woods all day. Those are days long gone.
Now I know why you interviewed George Hancock. He's from Johnstown. I know George, and I went to the first Johnstown Marathon too. I ran that. So I saw the inclined plane and all that. But was it Lately Field we finished that? No, that was Charleston. We finished on the track someplace.
But the Point Stadium, maybe.
I remember two great ultramarathoners were there at that race, Park Barner and Nick Marshall, both from the Harrisburg area. It used to be in the United States. The two great ultramarathoners lived within a few miles of one another in the Harrisburg area. Nick Marshall and Park Barner, and I knew them both. And Park one day just up and ran from Harrisburg to Pittsburgh.
Jeez.
We just ran.
What's interesting in that era, there were a lot of ultra runners, and that sport changed. Of course, Johnstown produced the national team 50-mile champion. Kerry Green, John Hess, and Steve Molnar won the team 50-miler in Central Park, New York in those mid-'70s. And those guys are probably ones you ran into on the marathon circuit in the 70s too.
I think Molnar was the winner of the first Nittany Valley Marathon.
Are there any personalities that you wrote an article about a particular runner or a particular athlete?
Yes. There was a long poem at the turn of the century that I wrote. It started out about Roger Bannister's 4-minute mile. It was going to be published in the Runner's Gazette, just a poem for Poets Corner. I started writing. I was not getting the kind of ideas that I wanted to write about it as a poem. And it diverged into the sports heroes of the 20th century. It's called Images, the sports images of the 20th century. Turned out to be like 17, 16, I don't know, multiple pages long. I touched on every sports hero that I could think of from the 20th century. Runners, writers, basketball players. Greg Louganis, diver, sport. And so I can send that to you to post too. It was titled Images, and it appeared in newspapers around the country. They picked it up. Not only did it appear in Runner's Gazette, but a few local Pennsylvania papers and a few around the country. That was when everybody was worried about the turn from 1999 to 2000 and whether it was going to blow up the world and whether it was going to ruin all the clocks and everything.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I worked on Y2K over in Africa, and what a time that was. It's been great, Bernie, going through all these stories, history, your career, your great, cheerful at age 80, still organizing and helping people stay in shape. What kind of people take your classes?
all different age groups. And the trick there, once again, is just like if you're a writer, you want to make an emotional connection with the reader. I want to make an emotional connection with my riders in spin class through the music. So I'm playing songs from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, span 60 years. I'm playing hit songs that have some emotional heft to them. Bruce Springsteen, Dancing in the Dark, everything from classic rock to R&B, and hitting on the hits that make the emotional connection with my riders. I think, but I'm not sure, I'm the oldest cycle instructor in the country. And I was covered by a local TV station here in March when I closed down one of the clubs. The idea, what the newsworthiness of the feature wasn't that the club was closing. It was that an 80-year-old was doing something that 80-year-olds don't normally do. So I got my 15 minutes of fame there. But I'm most proud of the fact that 16 of my class takers in spin classes have gone on to become instructors themselves.
It's another great legacy. What a great legacy. Yeah.
The Don Coryell of Air Coryell on the West Coast offense system.
The Flash Green crop of next generation instructors. Yeah. You do make a connection, Bernie. It's really great to talk to you. It's fun. It's uplifting to talk with you.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
I will make a little page with links and text of articles that you want me to, and we can put links to the Runner's Gazette and everything. With you, it'll be great to hopefully get some of your writing to some people who aren't familiar with it or don't remember it.
That's important to me. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. That's
all right. Talk to Glenn.
I would say once every few months. He seems to be quite busy. He and I both are at the age now where we're apt to be asleep at 2 p.m. and awake in the morning. He's a brilliant guy, and he's a very interesting guy to talk to. Those car rides we had were real trips, and when we get together, it's just one more story after another.
Yeah. All right. All right. Thanks for all your time, Bernie.
And I greatly appreciate you taking an interest in running in the 70s, and glad I could contribute a little something to it.
Okay. I hope you enjoyed another episode of Running in the 70s. Voices, stories, and memories of athletes who were running in the 70s. Until next time, wherever you are, keep looking forward and don't forget to look back.